The question seems simple enough on the surface. Who was the first Sith? Yet, like so many questions about the dark side of the Force, the answer refuses to cooperate with simplicity. It writhes and shifts, revealing different truths depending on how you approach it, much like the shadows themselves. Was the first Sith a red-skinned warrior king who unified a primitive world through blood and sorcery thousands of years before the Jedi Order even existed? Or was it a fallen Jedi Master who discovered forbidden knowledge and led a rebellion that would reshape galactic history? Perhaps it was neither. Perhaps it was the moment when two civilizations collided, when exiled Force users discovered a species that worshipped darkness as naturally as others breathed air. The truth is that the Sith, as we know them today, emerged from a collision of worlds, philosophies, and ambitions. To understand who the first Sith truly was, we must journey back through millennia of galactic history, to a time when the Republic was young and the Force was still revealing its deepest mysteries. We must walk through ancient tombs on windswept Korriban, where the bones of kings lie buried beneath crimson sands. We must witness the moment when Jedi became Dark Jedi, and when Dark Jedi became something far more terrible. Some historians would tell you the answer lies with a being named Addus, a towering figure whose charcoal black skin marked him as chosen from birth, who carved out an empire with an alchemically forged battle axe and ruled for 3 centuries. Others point to Ajunta Paul, a Jedi Master whose experiments with creating life led to exile and ultimately to the founding of a dark order that would plague the galaxy for tens of thousands of years. But perhaps the most fascinating answer is that there is no single first Sith. Instead, there were transformations. There were moments when one thing became another, when boundaries dissolved and new identities emerged from the fusion of species, philosophy, and raw dark side power. The Sith were not created in a moment. They evolved, like any living thing, adapting and changing across the vast reaches of time. This question matters because it shapes how we understand everything that came after. The conflict between Jedi and Sith has defined galactic history. The rule of two, the rise of the Empire, the fall of Anakin Skywalker, all of it traces its lineage back to those ancient days when the first Sith walked beneath alien stars. Understanding the beginning helps us comprehend the pattern, the endless cycle of conflict and betrayal that characterizes the dark side's adherents. So let us begin where any proper investigation must start, not with assumptions, but with examination. We will look at the Sith species themselves, at the kings who ruled before any Jedi dreamed of darkness. We will witness the schism that tore the Jedi Order apart and sent exiles fleeing into unknown space. We will stand beside those exiles as they discovered Korriban and forever changed what it meant to be Sith. The answer to who was first depends on what we mean by Sith itself, and to understand that, we must go back to the very beginning. King Addus, the original Sith-Ari, long before the Jedi Order began its watch over the galaxy, before the Republic spread its influence across thousands of worlds, there existed on a remote planet a species that would lend its name to the greatest threat civilization would ever know. The Sith were not originally an order or a philosophy. They were a people, red-skinned and fierce, bound to a desert world called Korriban. And among these original Sith, one figure towers above all others. His name was Addus, and in his time he was considered not merely a king, but a god incarnate. Addus was born different. While most Sith displayed the characteristic red skin of their species, ranging from crimson to darker shades, Addus emerged with skin as black as charcoal. This unusual coloration was immediately recognized by the Sith priests, the kisai, as a sign of divine favor. From his earliest days, Adas was raised to believe he was chosen, destined for greatness beyond that of ordinary Sith. The young Adas did not disappoint these expectations. He grew to enormous size, towering over his fellow Sith with a presence that commanded both fear and respect. But size alone does not make a ruler. What truly set Adas apart was his mastery of what the Sith called magic, what we now understand as the dark side of the Force. Sith sorcery had existed on Korriban for untold generations before Adas. The planet itself seemed to resonate with dark side energy. Whether this was a natural property of the world or a result of millennia of Sith rituals remains debated by scholars. What is certain is that the Sith species possessed an innate connection to the Force, particularly its darker aspects. Nearly every member of the species displayed some degree of Force sensitivity, a rate of occurrence almost unheard of in other populations. Adas took this natural Sith connection and refined it into something extraordinary. He studied the old ways, learning incantations and rituals that had been passed down through generations of Sith priests. He combined this mystical knowledge with a brilliant tactical mind and an absolute ruthlessness that would become characteristic of those who bore the Sith name. Korriban, in those ancient days, was not a unified world. Various Sith kingdoms and warlords controlled different territories, engaging in constant warfare with one another. This perpetual conflict had become accepted as the natural order of things. The Sith believed that struggle was necessary, that it strengthened the victors while eliminating the weak. Their society was built on this principle of survival through conflict. Adas decided to end the division. Around 28,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, he began his campaign to unite Korriban under a single rule, his own. He equipped himself with armor forged from the darkest metals, spiked and intimidating, designed to inspire terror in those who faced him. His primary weapon was a massive battle axe created through Sith alchemy, a blade that could cleave through stone as easily as flesh. The unification of Korriban was not accomplished through diplomacy or persuasion. Adas carved his empire from the bones of those who opposed him. When rival warlords challenged his authority, he met them in single combat, wielding his great axe with devastating efficiency. He drank the blood of defeated warriors to honor their deaths, a ritual that demonstrated both respect for worthy opponents and an absolute commitment to Sith tradition. Kingdom after kingdom fell before Adas's assault. Some rulers were killed in battle. Others were enslaved or executed as examples to those who might consider resistance.
The campaign was brutal and prolonged, a series of bloody conflicts that left Korriban's sands even redder than their natural hue.
But eventually, through violence and cunning, through demonstrations of power both martial and mystical, Adas achieved what no Sith before him had managed. He became the undisputed ruler of Korriban, king of all the Sith. The Sith people, witnessing this unprecedented unification, began to call him by a new title, Sithari. The word carried multiple meanings, Lord and Overlord, but also something deeper. The Sithari was prophesied to be a perfect being, one who would lead the Sith to greatness. In Adas, the Sith believed they had found this chosen one. His unusual appearance, his overwhelming power, his successful unification of their fractured world, all of it seemed to confirm divine selection. Adas's reign lasted nearly 300 years. This extraordinary lifespan was made possible through his mastery of the dark side, which he used to sustain his life far beyond natural limits. During these 3 centuries, Korriban knew a stability it had never experienced. The constant warfare between Sith factions ceased. Under Adas's iron rule, the Sith turned their attention outward, developing their civilization in ways previously impossible. The people generally believed Adas would live forever, that his reign would be eternal. He had become more than a king to them. He was their deity, their protector, the embodiment of everything it meant to be Sith. His rule became known as the Reign of the Axe, and monuments were erected in his honor across Korriban. The Valley of the Dark Lords, which would later house the tombs of countless Sith, began with preparations for Adas's eventual interment, though none expected that day to come soon. Then in Adas's 300th year, strangers arrived on Korriban. The Rakata were members of what they called the Infinite Empire, a vast interstellar civilization that had conquered hundreds of worlds using technology powered by the Force itself. The Rakata possessed knowledge far beyond what the Sith had achieved. They had mastered hyperspace travel, allowing them to cross vast distances between stars. They had developed weapons that could destroy entire cities. And they had turned the Force into a tool for domination on a scale the Sith could barely imagine. When the Rakata first made contact with Adas, they did not arrive as conquerors. They were subtle, patient, seeking first to understand this powerful Force-using species before making any aggressive moves. They presented themselves as teachers, offering gifts of knowledge to the great Sithari. Among the technologies the Rakata shared was the holocron, a device capable of storing not just information, but the very essence of its creator. This was no simple recording device. A holocron could preserve personality, memories, the totality of an individual's knowledge in a format that could teach future generations long after its creator had died. The Rakata taught Adas how to construct such a device, and the Sith King, recognizing the value of preserving his accumulated wisdom, created what would become known as the holocron of King Adas. But as Adas worked on his holocron, recording his secrets and accomplishments, the Rakata's true intentions became clear.
They had not come to Korriban as friends or equals.
They had come to add another world to their empire, to enslave the Sith as they had enslaved so many other species.
The Rakata likely assumed that the primitive Sith, despite their Force abilities, would be easily overcome by superior technology and numbers.
They had defeated many Force-using civilizations before. What they failed to account for was Adas himself. When the Rakata made their move to conquer Korriban, Adas was already 300 years old, his body sustained by dark side energy, for far beyond its natural span, had begun to feel the weight of centuries. But age had not diminished his power or his will. If anything, 300 years of rule had honed both to a razor's edge. Adas gathered his armies on the fields of Korriban. The Sith, unified under their king, prepared to defend their homeworld against these alien invaders. As Rakatan ships descended from the sky, as soldiers armed with Force-powered weapons marched onto Korriban's surface, the Sith warriors chanted their king's name, Adas.
Adas! Adas!
The battle was fierce and costly. The Rakata possessed technological advantages the Sith could not match. But the Sith fought with a ferocity born of protecting their home, driven by loyalty to their God King, empowered by the dark side energies that saturated their world. And at the forefront of the defense stood Adas himself, wielding his great axe, cutting down Rakata warriors by the dozens. In the end, the Sith prevailed. The Rakatan invasion was repelled. The Infinite Empire, which had conquered hundreds of worlds, was driven from Korriban in defeat. The Sith had protected their home against overwhelming odds, had proven that even the mighty Rakata could be beaten. But victory came at a terrible price. In the heat of battle, securing what he hoped would be freedom for his people, Adas fell. The ancient king who had ruled for 3 centuries, who had unified the Sith and defended them against extragalactic invasion, perished on the field of battle. The Sith mourned their Sithari. They entombed him with all the honors befitting a god king, placing his body in a specially prepared tomb in what would become the Valley of the Dark Lords. His holocron, which he had completed with the knowledge given by the Rakata, was passed to his second-in-command, his Shadow Hand, to be preserved for future generations. But while Adas had fallen, the Rakata had left something behind. The wreckage of their ships, their advanced technology, remained scattered across Korriban's surface. The Sith, studying these remnants, began to unlock secrets of space travel and advanced engineering that had been beyond their reach. In death, the Rakata invasion gave the Sith species the tools they needed to leave their homeworld and expand into the stars. Without Addis's unifying presence, Korriban soon descended back into the civil warfare that had characterized it before his rise. Various Sith leaders claimed the title of Sithari, but none could unite the species as Addis had done. The Sith spread to other worlds, establishing a capital on the ice planet Geost, but they remained fractured, divided into competing factions and kingdoms. Adas's legacy, however, endured. His name became legend among the Sith. The prophecy of the Sithari, the perfect being who would lead the Sith to ultimate triumph, was shaped by memories of his reign. Future Sith would study his holocron, seeking the wisdom of the ancient king. The monuments built in his honor stood for thousands of years, silent testaments to the king who had first united the Sith. 21,000 years after Addis's death, when exiled Dark Jedi discovered Korriban and encountered the Sith species for the first time, they would find Addis's legacy waiting for them. The Sith still told stories of their great king, still performed rituals in his memory, still studied the scraps of his teachings that had survived the millennia of warfare and decline. In many ways, Addis was the first Sith in the truest sense. He was of the Sith species. He embodied their values of strength through conflict. He mastered their sorcery to levels never before achieved, and he united them into a civilization capable of defending itself against galactic powers. Everything that would later be called Sith found its roots in the traditions and philosophies that Addis exemplified and codified during his 3-century reign. But the story of the Sith does not end with Addis any more than it began with him. To understand the full answer to our question, we must look beyond individual rulers to the species itself, to the culture and civilization that produced such figures. The Sith species. Before there were lords, before we can understand how the Sith became the order of Dark Lords that would terrorize the galaxy for millennia, we must understand who they were originally. The Sith were not born as conquerors of worlds or wielders of red lightsabers. They were a people, a distinct species with their own culture, beliefs, and way of life, shaped by their homeworld and their unique relationship with the Force. The Sith species originated on Korriban, a world located in the Outer Rim territories, within a region known as the Stygian Caldera. Korriban was not a gentle world. Its landscape consisted primarily of rocky deserts, mountains carved by endless winds, and valleys where the very air seemed thick with invisible presence. The planet's sun beat down on red sands, creating a harsh environment where only the strong survived. But Korriban's most distinctive feature was not visible to the naked eye. The planet was what Force users would later call a dark side nexus, a location where the dark side of the Force was unusually strong and accessible. Whether the planet naturally resonated with dark energy or whether millennia of Sith rituals and bloodshed had saturated it with darkness remains unknown. Perhaps both are true. Regardless of the cause, Korriban hummed with dark power, and this influenced every aspect of Sith civilization. The Sith themselves were immediately recognizable by their distinctive appearance. Their skin ranged in color from light pink to deep crimson, though the most common shades were various tones of red. This red coloration was not merely cosmetic but genetic, passed down through generations and intensifying with age, with infants typically born with lighter skin that darkened as they matured. Their facial structure displayed several unique features. Most prominent were the bone spurs that protruded from various parts of their bodies, particularly the elbows, and the facial tentacles that hung from their cheekbones like fleshy tendrils. These tentacles were not merely decorative but functional, capable of movement and displaying different expressions through twitching and other subtle shifts. The Sith also possessed cranial horns, pointed teeth, and eyes that glowed yellow or red, covered by distinctive cartilaginous eyebrow stalks. Their hands and feet typically bore 3 clawed digits, 2 facing forward and 1 backward, though some Sith possessed 5 digits in a more humanoid configuration.
Most Sith were naturally left-handed, another peculiarity of their species.
Their mouths were simian in structure, positioned below small noses, and some Sith displayed long, bony chins while others had more receding jawlines. But the Sith's most significant characteristic was invisible. Nearly every member of the species possessed sensitivity to the Force, where most species might produce one Force-sensitive individual in thousands or even millions. Among the Sith, Force sensitivity was almost universal. They had evolved or developed, through means unknown, a symbiotic relationship with the dark side itself. The Sith drew sustenance directly from dark side energy, and in turn, their very presence strengthened it. This near-universal Force sensitivity shaped every aspect of Sith society. Their culture revolved around the use of what they called magic, rituals, and techniques that manipulated the dark side to achieve various ends. Sith sorcery could heal or harm, create or destroy, enslave or empower. The Sith developed sophisticated understanding of Force alchemy, the art of using dark energy to transform and enhance living beings and objects. Sith society was rigidly stratified into a caste system. At the top were the rulers, whether kings or warlords, those who had proven their strength and claimed power through force. Below them were the Kisai, the priest caste, who maintained the religious traditions and performed the rituals that were central to Sith culture. These priests served as advisors to rulers, keepers of ancient knowledge, and interpreters of omens and prophecies. The warrior caste, known as the Massassi, formed the backbone of Sith military might. These were typically the largest and most physically imposing Sith, bred and trained for combat. The Massassi wielded traditional Sith weapons including vibro-axes, swords, and other melee implements, often enhanced through alchemical processes. They wore armor decorated with spikes and designed to intimidate, reflecting the Sith belief that fear was as potent a weapon as any blade. Below the warriors were various working castes, artisans, and builders who maintained Sith civilization. And at the bottom of society were slaves, beings who had been captured in warfare or born into servitude. The Sith saw no shame in slavery. To them, it was the natural order that the strong should dominate the weak, that those who could not defend themselves deserved subjugation. This acceptance of hierarchy and domination permeated all aspects of Sith culture. Violence was not considered barbaric or evil, but rather a natural and necessary part of existence, as fundamental as eating or sleeping. War was not something to be avoided but embraced as the crucible in which strength was tested and weakness eliminated. The Sith engaged in supposedly primitive practices like ritual sacrifice, offering slaves and prisoners to their gods, and using blood in their magical ceremonies. Yet beneath this veneer of barbarism, Sith civilization was remarkably sophisticated. They constructed impressive architecture, towering temples and monuments carved from Korriban stone. These structures were designed to inspire awe and fear, with imposing facades, vast halls, and intricate decorations that reflected their deep connection to dark side symbology. The tombs they built for their kings were marvels of engineering and artistry, designed to last for millennia. The Sith developed their own written language, a complex system of angular glyphs that would later be adopted by the Dark Jedi exiles who conquered them. This language was used to record history, preserve rituals, and mark important locations and artifacts. Sith texts contain knowledge of sorcery, alchemical formulas, and the wisdom of past rulers, all carefully maintained by the Kisai priests. Their understanding of alchemy was particularly advanced. Long before they encountered any other spacefaring species, the Sith had learned to manipulate life itself through the dark side. They created Sith spawn, creatures bred and altered through Force alchemy to serve various purposes. Some were war beasts, others guardians for tombs, still others served as living weapons too terrible to describe in polite company. The Sith practiced genetic manipulation as well, experimenting with crossbreeding between different strains of their own species to emphasize desired traits. They understood principles of heredity and bloodlines, carefully managing breeding to ensure that Force-sensitive children were produced and that desirable physical characteristics were preserved or enhanced. Their religion centered on worship of what they considered gods of the dark side. These deities represented various aspects of Sith philosophy: power, domination, passion, and the eternal struggle between strong and weak. Ritual practices included animal and sentient sacrifices, blood offerings, and elaborate ceremonies designed to channel dark side energy for various purposes. The Sith had developed their own martial traditions, combat styles that emphasized aggressive offense and the use of rage to fuel physical prowess. These fighting techniques would later influence the lightsaber forms created by Sith Lords, though in ancient times they were practiced with more conventional weapons. A Sith warrior in his prime was a terrifying opponent, combining natural physical advantages with Force-enhanced abilities and centuries of refined combat doctrine. Despite their strengths, the ancient Sith were also hampered by their nature. The constant internal warfare that characterized their society prevented true unity, except under the most powerful rulers like Adas. Betrayal and treachery were not just accepted but expected.
A Sith who failed to defend himself against plots and schemes was considered weak, unworthy of his position.
This created a culture where paranoia and constant vigilance were necessary for survival. The Sith were also xenophobic to an extreme degree. They viewed other species with suspicion and contempt, considering themselves superior by virtue of their Force sensitivity and ancient lineage. When the Rakata first arrived, the Sith were initially curious about these aliens, but this curiosity was always tempered by wariness and the assumption that any outsiders represented potential threats. By the time King Adiesus unified Korriban, the Sith species had already existed for thousands of years. They had survived contact with the Killiks, insectoid beings whose hives sometimes spread to Korriban. They had repelled the Rakata invasion. They had developed a rich, if brutal, civilization built on principles that would later define what it meant to be Sith in the philosophical sense. The Sith people believed they were destined for greatness. Their prophecies spoke of a Sithari who would arise to lead them to ultimate triumph. They saw themselves as chosen by the dark side, shaped by it into the perfect instruments of its will. Their entire culture was built around the conviction that strength through passion and conflict was the proper path, that peace and serenity were illusions that weakened those foolish enough to pursue them. When Adis died and Caliban descended back into warfare, the Sith species began to spread beyond their homeworld. Using technology salvaged from the Rakata invasion, they achieved spaceflight, settling on nearby worlds, most notably Ziost, which became a second major center of Sith civilization. For thousands of years, the Sith Empire, such as it was, existed in this form, a collection of warring kingdoms and factions spread across a handful of worlds, all calling themselves Sith, all believing in their manifest destiny. This was the civilization that the Dark Jedi exiles would discover 21,000 years after Odyssey's death. A species of red-skinned Force users, masters of dark side sorcery, believers in domination through strength, practitioners of ancient and terrible arts, living on a world that resonated with dark power. The Sith species, for all their internal divisions, represented an accumulation of dark side knowledge unlike anything else in the galaxy. And when these two forces met, when the exiled Dark Jedi encountered the Sith species, the collision would transform both into something new. Something that would threaten the galaxy for tens of thousands of years to come. But before we can understand that meeting, we must first understand who these Dark Jedi were, how they came to be exiled, and what drove them to the remote worlds where the Sith awaited.
We must examine the 100-year darkness and the fall of those who would become the first Sith Lords.
To understand who the first Sith Lord was, we must first understand the crisis that created them. The 100-year darkness, also known as the Second Great Schism, represents one of the darkest periods in Jedi history, a century of warfare that would reshape the galaxy and plant seeds that would bear terrible fruit for millennia to come. Around 7,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Jedi Order faced an internal challenge that would test its very foundations. The Order in those days was younger, less codified than it would later become, still exploring the full implications of the Force and its study. The Jedi Council worked to establish guidelines for how Force users should live and practice, attempting to create a sustainable philosophy that could guide Force sensitives for generations. But not all Jedi agreed with the direction the Council was taking. A faction within the Order grew increasingly frustrated with what they saw as arbitrary restrictions and needless limitations. These Jedi believed they had discovered truths about the Force that the Council refused to acknowledge. They wanted to push boundaries, to experiment, to discover knowledge that the more conservative members of the Order deemed too dangerous. The breaking point came when certain Jedi began experimenting with the power to create and shape life itself. These Force users had discovered that through manipulation of midi-chlorians and application of sufficient Force energy, they could alter living beings at a fundamental level. They could heal terrible injuries, extend lifespans, perhaps even create new life forms entirely. This was power unlike anything that Jedi had previously achieved, abilities that seemed to touch on the divine. But the Jedi Council was horrified by these experiments. They saw in this research a fundamental violation of the natural order, an arrogance that assumed Force users had the right to reshape life according to their whims. The Council declared that such experimentation was an abomination, that it drew too heavily on the dark side and would inevitably corrupt those who pursued it. They demanded that the research cease immediately, and that all knowledge gained from it be destroyed. The experimenting Jedi refused. They argued that the Council was being reactionary, that fear of the dark side was preventing exploration of the Force's full potential. They claimed that by embracing all aspects of the Force, including passion and emotion, they could achieve power impossible for those who limited themselves to serenity and peace.
The divide between the two factions grew wider, moving from philosophical disagreement to open hostility.
Among the leaders of this rebellious faction were figures whose names would become legendary in dark side lore.
Ajunta Paul, a Jedi master of tremendous strength and skill, served as the de facto commander of the dissidents.
He was a tactical genius, a powerful warrior, and a charismatic leader who could inspire others to follow him into the unknown. Paul had been among the first to discover the techniques for manipulating life, and he believed absolutely in the righteousness of his cause. Alongside Paul stood other powerful Jedi, Swords of Sin, who had mastered the creation of living weapons and biological plagues, using alchemy to craft horrors that could devastate entire battlefields. Her understanding of how to twist and reshape flesh through the Force was unparalleled, and she saw her work as art,
The ultimate expression of a Force user's creative power.
Zoxan, a humanoid who commanded the so-called Black Legions, brought military expertise and strategic thinking to the rebels. As a Marchioness, she had experience in leadership and organization, skills that proved invaluable as the Dark Jedi built their forces. Karness Moore, whose Force-centered battle tactics had proven devastatingly effective in conflicts prior to the Schism, understood how to use the Force not just as an individual power, but as a coordinated weapon wielded by groups of Force users acting in concert. Remulus Draper, a Baron and former Jedi Admiral, commanded what remained of the Rebels' fleet. His naval expertise allowed the Dark Jedi to contest control of space, preventing the Jedi Order from simply blockading them into submission. These five, along with 7 others who have been lost to history, formed the core leadership of the Dark Jedi Rebellion. Together they represented the 12 most powerful and skilled Force users who had turned away from the Jedi path. They became known as the Exiles, though that name would only be applied after their eventual defeat. The Jedi Council, recognizing that this schism could not be resolved peacefully, prepared for war.
They could not allow this corruption to spread, could not permit Jedi to openly practice dark side techniques while claiming to serve the light.
The Order mobilized its forces, calling upon Jedi from across the galaxy to stand against the rebels. What began as a philosophical dispute erupted into a century of bloodshed. The 100-year darkness had begun. The Dark Jedi, having committed themselves fully to exploring the dark side, unleashed abilities that shocked and horrified the Jedi Order. They used their mastery of alchemy to create terrible creatures, living weapons bred specifically for warfare. Leviathans, massive beasts capable of draining life force from their victims, were deployed against Jedi positions. Shamblers, Howlers, Pit Horrors, and other abominations stalked the battlefields, each designed to exploit some weakness in Jedi defenses. Source of Sin proved particularly inventive in crafting these Sith spawn. She experimented with different base creatures, using alchemy to enhance their natural abilities while adding new capabilities drawn from dark side energy. Her creations could regenerate from terrible wounds, possessed unnatural strength and speed, and in some cases demonstrated crude intelligence that allowed them to follow complex battle plans. The Dark Jedi themselves fought with a ferocity and passion that contrasted sharply with the Jedi's measured approach. While Jedi sought to end conflicts quickly and with minimal casualties, the Dark Jedi embraced warfare as an end in itself, seeing battle as the ultimate test of strength and skill. They poured emotion into their Force abilities, anger and hatred that amplified their power far beyond what should have been possible for Force users of their nominal skill level. Republic worlds found themselves caught in the crossfire as the conflict spread, the Dark Jedi, needing resources and territory to sustain their war effort, seized control of systems through force and intimidation. They demanded tribute, conscripted soldiers, and strip-mined worlds for materials to build their war machines. The civilian suffering during this period was immense, with countless beings displaced or killed in the fighting. The Jedi Order, for its part, found itself pushed to its limits. The Dark Jedi's willingness to use any tactic, to create weapons of mass destruction, to sacrifice entire populations in pursuit of victory, forced the Jedi to adapt. They developed new fighting techniques specifically designed to counter dark side abilities. They learned to shield themselves against the psychological attacks that Dark Jedi favored. They studied their enemies' tactics and developed countermeasures, but the cost was staggering. Jedi fell by the hundreds in battle against the Dark Jedi and their monstrous creations. Promising students were killed before reaching their full potential. Masters who had trained generations of Jedi perished in single moments of violence. The Order's numbers dwindled as the war dragged on year after year, decade after decade. The Dark Jedi suffered losses as well. Their reliance on the dark side, while granting them great power, also made them unstable and prone to turning on one another. Rivalries within their ranks led to infighting even as they battled the Jedi. Several of the Dark Jedi leaders fell to assassinations by their own followers, ambitious subordinates who saw opportunities to seize power for themselves. Karnus Muur proved particularly skilled at political maneuvering within the Dark Jedi ranks, playing potential rivals against each other while building his own power base. His tactical abilities on the battlefield were matched by his capacity for intrigue off it, making him one of the most feared and respected of the Dark Jedi commanders. As the conflict entered its 10th decade, both sides had been exhausted by the prolonged warfare. The Jedi Order had lost much of its strength, with entire generations of Jedi having known nothing but war. The Republic's resources had been strained to the breaking point, but the Dark Jedi were in even worse condition. Their internal divisions, their propensity for betrayal, and their gradual corruption by the dark side had weakened them significantly. The war finally reached its climax at the Battle of Korbos. Around 6,900 years before Yavin, the Dark Jedi made their stand on this world, gathering their remaining forces for what they hoped would be a decisive victory. They deployed every weapon at their disposal, every creature they had bred, every dark technique they had mastered over the century of warfare. The battle was cataclysmic. Jedi and Dark Jedi clashed in lightsaber duels while around them Sith spawn and soldiers fought and died. The ground ran red with blood. The very air seemed to crackle with the energies unleashed by so many Force users engaged in desperate combat. Leviathans tore through Jedi lines only to be brought down by concentrated Force attacks. Dark Jedi called upon terrible powers, draining life, summoning lightning, twisting reality itself in their efforts to achieve victory. But despite their power, despite their willingness to sacrifice everything for victory, the Dark Jedi were ultimately defeated. The Jedi Order, fighting for survival and for the protection of the galaxy, proved stronger in this final confrontation. One by one, the Dark Jedi commanders fell or were forced to surrender. Their armies were shattered. Their monstrous creations were destroyed or driven into hiding. Of the 12 leaders, all survived the battle, though many bore terrible wounds. Ajunta Pal, Sorza Sin, Zoksan, Karnus Muur, Remulus Draper, and 7 others whose names would later be lost to time, found themselves prisoners of the Jedi Order, convicted of high treason against both the Order and the Republic. The Jedi Council faced a dilemma. These dark Jedi were too dangerous to be allowed to remain free, but executing them seemed a violation of Jedi principles, too dark an act for an order dedicated to preserving life. Some argued for imprisonment, but no prison could hold Force users of such power indefinitely. Eventually, the Council decided on what they believed was a merciful solution. The Dark Jedi would be exiled from Republic space. They would be stripped of their weapons, their belongings, everything except the clothes on their backs. They would be loaded onto an unarmed galleon, a simple transport vessel with minimal supplies and no weapon systems. Then they would be sent into the unknown regions of space, beyond the borders of the Republic, to live out their lives far from civilization. It was mercy of a sort. The Dark Jedi would live, but they would be removed from the galaxy they had terrorized. They could never return, never again threaten the Republic or corrupt others with their dark teachings. The Jedi believed they had found a just solution that honored both their principles and the necessity of protecting the galaxy. With lightsaber points at their backs, the 12 Dark Jedi leaders and their surviving followers were marched aboard the galleon. Thousands had followed them into rebellion, but only a fraction had survived the century of warfare. Those who boarded that ship were the hardest, the most skilled, the ones whose commitment to the dark side had allowed them to endure when others fell. As the ship left Republic space, heading into uncharted regions guided by Sorza Syn's ability to sense the way through the Force, the exiled Dark Jedi had time to reflect on their defeat. They had lost their war, lost their place in civilization, been cast out like criminals. Everything they had fought for over 100 years seemed to have been for nothing. But among the 12 leaders, one had no intention of accepting defeat.
Adjunta Paul, High General of the Dark Jedi forces, refused to believe that their story ended in exile. He gathered the other commanders and spoke to them of their future.
They had learned the power of the dark side. They had mastered techniques that Jedi could never understand. They had created life, shaped it, commanded armies of their own creation. This knowledge, this power, could not be wasted. Somewhere in the unknown regions, they would find a new home. They would build a new civilization, one not bound by the Jedi's foolish restrictions. And someday, perhaps, they would return. The other exiles agreed. Sorza Syn, using her sensitivity to the Force, guided their ship through the dangerous hyperspace region known as the Stygian Caldera. She sensed a destination, a world that called to her through the Force, a planet where the dark side sang with power unlike anything she had encountered before. The ship emerged from hyperspace near a red desert world. As the exiles looked upon it from orbit, they knew they had found something significant. The planet below radiated dark side energy so strongly that even the least sensitive among them could feel it. This was a dark side nexus, a place where their powers would be amplified, where they could study the dark arts without restraint. Sorza Syn consulted the limited star charts they had managed to preserve. The world had a name in ancient records. It was called Korriban. As their ship descended toward the surface, the exiles had no idea that they were about to encounter a civilization that would change everything. They were not the first to discover the secrets of the dark side. Waiting for them on that crimson world was a species that had been practicing dark side sorcery for millennia. A people who would both learn from and teach these exiled Jedi, a fusion of cultures that would create something new. The Dark Jedi were about to meet the Sith, the 12 exiles, Dark Jedi who became gods. The galleon touched down on Korriban's surface in a valley surrounded by towering monuments. The exiles, stepping out of their cramped vessel after weeks of travel, found themselves in a landscape unlike anything they had encountered before. Red sand stretched in every direction beneath a harsh sun. Massive tombs carved from stone dominated the horizon, their facades decorated with disturbing symbols and images of warfare and death. The very air seemed thick with invisible energy, the omnipresent hum of dark side power that saturated this world. And they were not alone. The Sith had detected the ship's arrival. A delegation of natives approached the landing site, red-skinned humanoids adorned with ceremonial garments and displaying visible bone spurs and facial tentacles. These were members of the Kisai priest caste, along with armed Massassi warriors who watched the newcomers with suspicion and readiness for violence. The meeting between the exiled Dark Jedi and the Sith species was a pivotal moment in galactic history, though neither side yet understood its significance. Here were two groups who had independently discovered and mastered the dark side of the Force, meeting for the first time on a world that resonated with the very power they both served. The Sith, despite their sophistication in some areas, possessed technology far inferior to what the Jedi exiles had known in the Republic. They had achieved limited spaceflight using salvaged Rakata technology, but they had never encountered beings quite like these pale-skinned strangers who had arrived from the sky in a vessel beyond anything the Sith could construct. More importantly, the Sith immediately recognized that these newcomers were powerful in what they called magic.
The exiles, even weakened from their defeat and subsequent journey, demonstrated Force abilities that impressed the Sith.
When Ajunta Paul casually lifted several large stones with a thought, when Sorza Sin created fire from nothing, when the other exiles displayed powers that matched or exceeded what the greatest Sith sorcerers could achieve, the natives began to reassess their initial wariness. The exiles, for their part, were astonished to discover an entire species of Force sensitives. The Jedi Order had encountered Force-sensitive species before, but never one where nearly every individual possessed the ability to touch the Force. More than that, the Sith clearly had centuries, perhaps millennia, of accumulated dark side knowledge, techniques and rituals that the exiles had never imagined. Sorza Sin, whose expertise in alchemy had made her invaluable during the 100-Year Darkness, found herself particularly fascinated by what she sensed on Korriban. The Sith had been practicing their own forms of alchemy for generations, creating war beasts and enhancing living beings in ways that paralleled her own experiments. She sensed scrolls and texts, ancient knowledge preserved in tombs and temples across the planet. The initial meeting was tense but not violent. The Sith, recognizing power when they saw it, offered the traditional greeting given to worthy beings. The exiles, desperate to find a place in this unknown region of space, responded with courtesy and interest rather than the dominance they might have attempted in different circumstances. But as the exiles learned more about Sith society, as they toured the Valley of Tombs and witnessed Sith rituals, a plan began to form in Ajunta Paul's mind.
These Sith were powerful, yes, but they were also primitive in many ways.
They had no understanding of galactic politics, no experience with advanced technology, no exposure to the sophisticated Force techniques that the Jedi had refined over millennia. With the right approach, these Sith could be shaped into something magnificent, a tool that the exiles could use to build the empire they had dreamed of during the 100-Year Darkness. The other commanders agreed with Paul's assessment. They had been given a gift by the Force itself, a population of dark side users who could serve as the foundation for a new civilization. All they needed to do was take control. The subjugation of the Sith species did not happen overnight. The exiles, despite their power, numbered only in the hundreds, while the Sith numbered in the millions across Korriban and Ziost.
Direct conquest was impractical.
Instead, the Dark Jedi chose a more subtle approach. They began by demonstrating their superiority in ways designed to awe rather than threaten. Ajunta Paul challenged and defeated Sith warriors in single combat, wielding his lightsaber with skill beyond anything the Sith had witnessed. The lightsaber itself, a weapon the Sith had never encountered, seemed like magic made solid, a blade of pure energy that could cut through anything. Sorza Sin shared some of her alchemical knowledge with Sith practitioners, demonstrating techniques that amplified what the natives already knew.
In return, she gained access to Sith temples and tombs, where she studied their accumulated lore with fierce intensity.
Her journal entries from this period reveal her excitement at discovering what she called an untapped wealth of knowledge about the dark side of the Force.
Exo-Zen demonstrated advanced Force healing, restoring Sith who had suffered terrible injuries, displaying mastery of dark side healing techniques that the Sith healers had never achieved. This ability to preserve life and restore the injured made her particularly valued among the people who engaged in constant warfare. Remulus Drapa shared his knowledge of space travel and stellar navigation, teaching the Sith how to better utilize the Rakata technology they had salvaged. This opened up possibilities for Sith expansion that had previously been impossible. Carnus Muir demonstrated battle meditation, showing how a single Force user could coordinate and enhance the abilities of an entire army. When he used this technique to help a small force of Sith warriors defeat a much larger opposing faction, his reputation grew exponentially. As the exiles demonstrated power after power, ability after ability that exceeded what the Sith had thought possible, the natives' perception of them began to shift. These were not merely powerful sorcerers. They were something more, beings of such strength that they seemed to transcend normal limitations. Whispers began to spread that the strangers were perhaps not merely visitors, but emissaries of the dark side itself. The Kisai priests, keepers of Sith religious traditions, began to worship the exiles as demigods. They drew parallels between the newcomers and ancient Sith legends, particularly the stories of King Adas. If Adas had been the Sithari, chosen by the Force to lead the Sith, perhaps these 12 represented a new divine intervention, a collective of beings sent to elevate the Sith to their destined greatness. This religious veneration was exactly what the exiles needed. They encouraged it, accepting worship while remaining somewhat mysterious about their origins. They positioned themselves not as conquerors but as teachers and guides, beings who had come to help the Sith achieve their full potential. The political situation on Korriban aided their plan. At the time of the exiles' arrival, the current ruler was Hakagram Graush, a Sith king who controlled much of Korriban but faced constant challenges from rival warlords. Graush was powerful and cunning, but he was also aging, and his hold on power was not absolute. Graush initially welcomed the exiles, seeing them as potential allies who could help him consolidate his rule. He allowed them access to Sith territories, granted them positions of honor, and sought their counsel on matters of war and sorcery. For a time, this arrangement served both parties. Graush received valuable advice and assistance from beings of obvious power. The exiles gained time to learn about Sith society and to plot their ultimate takeover. But Ajunta Paul had not survived a century of warfare and the politics of the Dark Jedi Rebellion by being patient when opportunity presented itself. As he learned more about Sith society, he understood that the Sith respected strength above all else. They would never truly submit to the exiles unless the newcomers proved themselves stronger than any Sith ruler. The confrontation, when it came, was swift and brutal. Ajunta Paul challenged Hakagam Graush directly, claiming that as the most powerful Force user on Korriban, he deserved to rule. Graush, confident in his own abilities and the loyalty of his warriors, accepted the challenge.
The duel took place in front of an assembled crowd of Sith nobility, warriors, and priests. By all accounts, it was not a particularly long fight. Paul, who had fought against Jedi Masters during the 100-Year Darkness, who had refined his skills over decades of constant warfare, simply outclassed Grouch. The Sith King's sorcery was impressive by local standards, but it paled in comparison to techniques Paul had mastered. With a single, decisive strike, Ajunta Paul beheaded Hakagram Grouse. As the king's body fell to the ground, Paul claimed the throne of Korriban, declaring himself the blood heir to the legendary King Addas. The Sith, witnessing this display of overwhelming power, accepted his claim. In their culture, might made right. Paul had proven himself the strongest, and therefore he deserved to rule.
The other 11 commanders became his shadow hands, trusted lieutenants who would help administer the growing Sith Empire. Each brought their particular expertise to this task. Sorza Sin became the chief alchemist, responsible for developing new Sith spawn and enhancing Sith warriors. Zozan established training programs for Sith Force users, teaching them techniques from Jedi tradition adapted for dark-side use. Karnus Moore organized the military, implementing tactical innovations that made Sith armies far more effective. Remulus Draper oversaw expansion into space, building ships and training navigators. Together, the 12 exiles and the Sith species they now ruled began to create something new. They called themselves by a new title, one that combined their role as rulers with the name of the species they governed. They were the Dark Lords of the Sith. Ajunta Paul specifically claimed the title Genari, a Sith word meaning Dark Lord, marking himself as the supreme authority. Thus was born the Sith Order, distinct from both the Jedi Order they had left behind and the original Sith species they now ruled. This new Sith combined Jedi techniques with Sith sorcery, Republic military knowledge with native Sith warriors, the organizational skills of the Jedi Order with the brutal efficiency of Sith culture. The transformation was not purely cultural or philosophical. The Dark Jedi began the process of interbreeding with the Sith species, creating a hybrid population that would eventually come to be known as Sith purebloods. Sorza Sin discovered that humans and Sith were genetically compatible enough to produce viable offspring, and she encouraged this intermixing as a way to combine the best traits of both groups. Over the generations that followed, this hybridization would create a ruling class that displayed physical characteristics of the Sith species: red skin, facial tentacles, bone spurs, combined with the diversity and adaptability of human genetics. The original pure Sith species would become increasingly rare, bred into a hybrid population that carried both legacies. The exiles established their capital on Korriban, with a secondary center on the ice world of Zeost. They began constructing massive temples and academies where future generations would be trained in the dark side. The architecture reflected the fusion of cultures, combining Sith traditional designs with innovations from the exiles' Republic background.
But perhaps most importantly, the exiles began to codify the philosophy that would define the Sith Order for millennia to come.
Sorza Sin, drawing on her experiences and insights from both Jedi teachings and Sith traditions, wrote what would become known as the Sith Code, where the Jedi Code emphasized peace, serenity, and passive understanding. The Sith Code celebrated passion, strength, and active seizure of power. It rejected the Jedi's selflessness in favor of embracing one's own desires and ambitions. It saw conflict not as something to be avoided, but as the crucible in which true strength was forged. This philosophical foundation would guide the Sith Order for tens of thousands of years. It would be refined and reinterpreted by countless Dark Lords, but its core message remained the same. Power was the goal, passion was the path, and the weak existed to be dominated by the strong. As the exiles settled into their new roles as Dark Lords of the Sith, as they began building the civilization that would eventually challenge the Republic itself, they perhaps reflected on their journey. They had been Jedi, servants of the light who had discovered forbidden knowledge. They had become Dark Jedi, rebels against an order they saw as restrictive and fearful. They had been defeated and exiled, cast into unknown space to live or die, far from civilization. And now they were Sith Lords, rulers of a dark empire, creators of a new order that would endure longer than they could imagine. They had found not just survival but triumph, had transformed exile into opportunity, had become something greater than what they had been. They were no longer simply fallen Jedi. They had become the first Dark Lords of the Sith, and in doing so, they had changed galactic history forever. The question of who was the first true Sith had become more complex with their arrival, but one thing was certain. They had created a legacy that would never be forgotten. Ajunta Pall, first Dark Lord of the Sith among the 12 exiles who conquered the Sith species and established the Sith Order, one stands above the rest as the founder and first Dark Lord. Ajunta Pall's journey from Jedi Master to creator of the greatest threat the galaxy would ever know represents a transformation that would be repeated in various forms throughout history, but his was the first, the template from which all others would follow. Paul's early life as a Jedi is largely lost to history. We know he achieved the rank of Jedi Master, which speaks to both his strength in the Force and his understanding of Jedi philosophy before his fall. He must have been a respected member of the Order, trusted enough to train others, powerful enough to command respect among his peers. Something in his character, however, led him to question what he had been taught. The discovery that would change Paul's life came when he began experimenting with the power to create and shape life. Using the Force, he found he could manipulate midi-chlorians, could alter living beings at a cellular level, could perhaps even create entirely new forms of life. This was power that seemed almost divine in its implications. The ability to shape existence itself according to one's will. When the Jedi Council learned of these experiments, they were horrified. They saw in Paul's research a fundamental violation of natural law, an arrogance that assumed Force users had the right to play God. The Council denounced his work as an abomination and demanded he cease immediately. They declared that such experiments drew too heavily on the dark side and would inevitably corrupt those who pursued them. Paul refused. He genuinely believed that his research was not only acceptable but necessary for understanding the Force's full potential. He saw the Council's rejection as fear disguised as wisdom, a refusal to acknowledge truths that challenged their comfortable assumptions about the Force and its proper use.
If the Council would not permit this research, then perhaps the Council itself was the problem.
This philosophical disagreement transformed into outright rebellion.
Paul gathered others who shared his views, Jedi who believed the Council's restrictions were hampering their growth and understanding.
He organized them, trained them, and ultimately led them in a war against the order he had once served.
That war, the 100-year darkness, would cost countless lives and devastate dozens of worlds.
Throughout that century of conflict, Paul proved himself a brilliant military commander and a devastating warrior. He served as High General of the Dark Jedi forces, coordinating attacks across multiple systems, developing tactics to counter Jedi abilities, and leading from the front in crucial battles. His mastery of lightsaber combat was legendary even before his fall, and his embrace of the dark side only enhanced his already formidable skills. But warfare alone cannot sustain a cause for a century. Paul was also a political leader. holding together a coalition of strong-willed Force users who constantly competed for dominance within their own ranks. He managed rivalries among his commanders, rewarded loyalty while preventing any single subordinate from growing powerful enough to challenge him,
and maintained unity of purpose, even as internal conflicts threatened to tear the Dark Jedi apart.
When the final battle came at Korbos, Paul fought with everything he had, but even he could not overcome the combined might of the Jedi Order fighting for its survival. Defeat, when it came, must have been bitter for a being of Paul's pride and power. He had believed absolutely in the righteousness of his cause, had sacrificed a century to the fight, and in the end had lost. The exile was intended as mercy, a punishment that preserved life while removing the threat. But for Paul, it represented opportunity. He refused to accept that his story ended in defeat. When Sorcerer's Sin guided their ship to Korriban, when they discovered the Sith species, Paul immediately understood what this meant. Here was a second chance, a new beginning, a path to creating everything he had dreamed of during the 100-year darkness, but had failed to achieve. His decision to challenge and kill Hakagrum Grouch was calculated and decisive. Paul understood Sith culture well enough by then to know that they would respect only strength, that words and promises meant nothing compared to demonstrated power. By personally defeating their king, by claiming the throne through right of conquest, he established himself in a way that the Sith could not question. As Janari, as the first Dark Lord of the Sith, Paul set about building a civilization that would embody everything he believed the Jedi Order should have been. The Sith would not fear passion or emotion, but would embrace them as sources of strength. They would not shy away from studying the Force's darker aspects, but would master them completely. They would not serve some abstract ideal of peace, but would pursue power openly and without apology. Paul's administration of the early Sith Empire displayed the same organizational skills that had served him during the 100-year darkness. He established a hierarchy with himself at the apex, the other 11 exiles as his shadow hands, and below them levels of Sith Lords commanding territories and followers. Competition was encouraged as a way to ensure only the strong advanced, but open rebellion against the Dark Lord was punishable by death.
Under Paul's leadership, the Sith Empire began to expand beyond Korriban.
Using knowledge brought by the exiles and enhanced by Sith sorcery, they built ships capable of traveling between stars. They conquered nearby systems, subjugating other species and incorporating them into their growing empire. The Sith became not just inhabitants of a single world, but rulers of a small but growing interstellar civilization. Paul personally oversaw the training of the next generation of Sith. He combined Jedi teaching methods with Sith traditions, creating a comprehensive approach to dark side education. Students learn not just philosophy and Force techniques, but also history, politics, and the practical skills necessary for ruling. The Academy on Korriban became the center of this educational system, a place where young Sith were forged into weapons of the dark side. He commissioned the creation of massive monuments and temples, structures that would endure for millennia as testaments to Sith power. The Valley of the Dark Lords expanded with new tombs prepared for him and his fellow exiles, enormous constructions that made clear the importance of those who would be interred within. These were not merely burial places, but statements of power, designed to awe future generations. Paul's mastery of the dark side only grew during his years as Dark Lord. Free from the restrictions that had hampered his research as a Jedi, able to study Sith texts and learn techniques preserved for millennia, he achieved levels of power that exceeded what he had possessed during the 100-year darkness. His lightsaber skills became legendary, his command of Force lightning devastating, his ability to dominate other minds nearly absolute. Yet for all his power and accomplishments, Paul apparently retained some capacity for reflection. Millennia after his death, when the Jedi Knight Revan entered Paul's tomb on Korriban during the Jedi Civil War, he encountered the ancient Dark Lord spirit, still bound to the tomb by his connection to the dark side and perhaps by lingering regrets. The spirit of Ajunta Paul that spoke to Revan displayed surprising self-awareness about his choices and their consequences. He acknowledged that the rebellion against the Jedi had been wrong, that the path to the dark side had led to corruption and betrayal rather than enlightenment. He spoke of pride turning to shame, of power that ultimately proved hollow, of an eternity spent in a tomb, contemplating mistakes that could never be undone.
When Revan offered him the chance to let go of his pain and return to the light side of the Force, Paul accepted.
This redemption, if we can call it that, suggests that beneath all the power and philosophy, beneath the role of Dark Lord and creator of the Sith Order, remained something of the Jedi Master he had once been,
capable of recognizing and regretting the darkness he had embraced.
But this redemption came thousands of years too late to undo what Paul had created. By then, the Sith Order he founded had risen and fallen multiple times, spawning new incarnations with each collapse, spreading dark side philosophy across the galaxy, influencing countless beings toward darkness. The Sith had become far larger than any single individual, an idea and an identity that could survive the death of any particular Dark Lord.
Ajunta Paul's legacy is complex and contradictory.
He was a seeker of knowledge who became a destroyer, a creator who built something that would bring untold suffering to the galaxy, a leader who unified the Dark Jedi and the Sith species into something new, and ultimately a being who spent eternity regretting the choices that had defined his existence. As the first Dark Lord of the Sith, Paul set precedents that would shape the Order for millennia. The cycle of betrayal and succession, where apprentices eventually turned on masters. The emphasis on individual power balanced against organizational structure, the combination of Sith passion with calculated planning, the willingness to use any means necessary to achieve one's goals. All of these became hallmarks of the Sith Order, traceable back to Paul's leadership and example. In answering the question of who was the first true Sith, Ajunta Paul has perhaps the strongest claim to the title First Sith Lord. He led the transformation of exiled Dark Jedi into the founders of the Sith Order. He established the organizational structure and philosophical framework that would define the Sith for thousands of years. He personally created the fusion of Jedi knowledge and Sith tradition that made the Order so formidable. But his story also illustrates why this question has no simple answer. Paul was not born Sith. He became Sith through a long process of transformation, from Jedi to Dark Jedi to exile to conqueror to Dark Lord. The Sith he ruled were not the species he encountered, but a hybrid of human and Sith genetics, a fusion of cultures and philosophies. The Order he created drew on traditions that predated him by millennia, incorporating knowledge from King Adas and other ancient Sith kings. Paul was first in some ways, but not in others. First Dark Lord, yes. First to organize the Sith into a formal order with structured hierarchy, yes. First to create the specific philosophy and approach that would characterize Sith Lords for thousands of years, yes. But not the first to use the name Sith, not the first to master the dark side on Korriban, not the first to envision an empire built on dark side principles. He was a beginning, but not the beginning. And that distinction matters as we attempt to untangle this question of who truly was first. The transformation. When Dark Jedi became Sith, The story of how exiled Dark Jedi became the Sith Lords we know from galactic history is not a story of instant transformation. It was a gradual process, a blending of cultures and philosophies that took place over generations, fundamentally changing both the human exiles and the Sith species they encountered.
Understanding this transformation helps us grasp why the question of first Sith is so complex.
When the 12 exiles and their followers first arrived on Korriban, they were still Dark Jedi in every meaningful sense. They had been trained in Jedi tradition, thought in Jedi concepts even if they rejected Jedi conclusions, and identified themselves primarily as rebels against the Jedi Order rather than as something new. The Sith species, meanwhile, had their own complete civilization with thousands of years of accumulated tradition. The initial relationship was one of conquest, with the exiles using their superior knowledge and technology to dominate the Sith species. But domination alone does not create cultural fusion. What happened over the following years was something more subtle and profound. The two groups began to genuinely merge, creating something that was neither pure Dark Jedi nor pure Sith, but a hybrid that took the best, or worst, from certain perspectives, of both. Sorcerer Sin's journal, which was later included in the Book of Sith, compiled by Darth Sidious, provides invaluable insight into this transformation process. Writing in the years immediately after their arrival on Korriban, Sin documented her discoveries about Sith civilization with a mixture of academic interest and dark enthusiasm. She was particularly fascinated by Sith alchemy, finding that it paralleled her own experiments but used different techniques and drew on millennia of accumulated knowledge. The Sith had been practicing biological manipulation since long before the Dark Jedi discovered the secret of creating life. They had developed sophisticated understanding of how to alter living beings through the Force, how to breed war beasts, how to enhance warriors beyond natural limitations. Sin threw herself into studying these techniques, exploring tombs and temples across Korriban to uncover ancient texts. She discovered scrolls hidden in the mongrel altar, protected by curses that would have killed lesser Force users. She studied breeding pens on Ziost, where the Sith kept exotic creatures for alchemical experiments. She interviewed Kisai priests who preserved oral traditions of sorcery going back thousands of years. In her journal, Sin wrote extensively about specific Sith practices, the creation of talismans and amulets that could focus dark side energy, the use of Sith holocrons, which the species had learned from the Rakata and adapted to their own purposes, the incantations and rituals that Sith sorcerers used to channel the Force in ways that Jedi had never imagined. She documented everything she learned, recognizing that she was witnessing the merger of two distinct approaches to the dark side. But the exchange of knowledge went both ways. While Sin and the other exiles learned from Sith tradition, they also taught the Sith what they had brought from the Republic: lightsaber construction and combat techniques, advanced Force abilities that required precise control rather than raw power, sophisticated military tactics developed during the 100-Year Darkness, organizational methods for managing large groups of Force users. This exchange created something unique. The Sith Order that emerged from this fusion combined the passion and raw power of Sith tradition with the precision and sophistication of Jedi-derived techniques. A Sith Lord could call upon ancient sorcery to create monsters while also wielding a lightsaber with skill equal to any Jedi Master. They could use Sith alchemy to enhance their bodies while also employing refined Force abilities like battle meditation or Force stealth. Perhaps the most visible sign of transformation was the interbreeding between the human exiles and the Sith species. Sorcerer Sin's research confirmed that humans and Sith were genetically compatible, capable of producing hybrid offspring. She encouraged this intermixing, seeing it as a way to combine human adaptability with Sith Force sensitivity and natural dark side affinity. The resulting children carried traits from both parent species. They typically displayed the red skin characteristic of the Sith, along with facial tentacles and sometimes bone spurs, but in more subdued form than pure Sith. Their Force sensitivity remained extremely high, inheriting the near-universal Force connection of the Sith species. Over generations, this hybrid population became the ruling class of the Sith Empire, replacing both pure Sith and pure humans at the highest levels of power. These Sith purebloods, as they would later be called, embodied the merger of two civilizations. They looked Sith enough to be recognized as part of that species, carried Sith traditions, and identified as Sith, but they also possessed human characteristics and the knowledge brought by the exiles.
They were living symbols of the transformation that had occurred.
The cultural transformation extended beyond genetics. The exiles adopted Sith customs and traditions, incorporating them into their daily lives. They learned the Sith language, eventually using it for their most important texts and rituals. They adopted Sith burial practices, preparing elaborate tombs for themselves in the Valley of the Dark Lords. They embraced the Sith caste system, though they placed themselves at its apex as the new ruling class. At the same time, they imposed their own structures on Sith society. The Sith Empire became more organized, with clearer hierarchies and more efficient administration, reflecting principles the exiles had learned during their time in the Republic. Sith academies were restructured to include systematic Force training rather than the more haphazard approach that had previously characterized Sith education. Military forces were reorganized along lines the exiles had developed during the 100-Year Darkness. The philosophical transformation was perhaps most profound. Sorza Sin is credited with writing the Sith Code, though she likely drew on ideas from multiple sources, combining Sith tradition with dark Jedi philosophy and her own insights. This code became the foundational philosophy of the Sith Order, defining what it meant to be Sith in a way that had never been articulated before. The Sith Code rejected peace in favor of passion, arguing that emotion and desire were sources of strength rather than weaknesses to be overcome. It replaced the Jedi's emphasis on knowledge with a focus on power as the ultimate goal. It saw conflict and struggle as necessary and valuable rather than unfortunate necessities. Where the Jedi sought harmony with the Force, the Sith Code advocated seizing control of it, bending it to one's will through strength. This code resonated with existing Sith beliefs, particularly their view that warfare and competition were natural and healthy, but it also refined these beliefs, giving them philosophical justification and connecting them to a larger understanding of the Force and existence. The result was a coherent ideology that could guide Sith thinking for millennia. The transformation worked on a practical level as well. Within a generation of the exiles' arrival, the Sith Empire had expanded significantly. Using ships built with knowledge from both traditions, Sith forces began conquering nearby systems. These conquests were more successful than the Sith species' earlier expansions had been because they combined Sith ferocity and dark side power with sophisticated military tactics and coordinated strategy. Conquered worlds were integrated into the Empire using administrative techniques adapted from the Republic. Local populations were enslaved or subjugated, their resources extracted to fuel further expansion. Sith Lords were assigned to govern these territories, creating a network of power that extended across multiple star systems. The Sith Empire was becoming a genuine interstellar civilization rather than just a single species native to one world. But the transformation also introduced elements that would later prove problematic. The Dark Jedi brought with them the politics and infighting that had characterized their rebellion. Sith Lords plotted against each other constantly, seeking to advance their own power at the expense of rivals. Betrayal became not just accepted but expected, a normal part of Sith politics. The same dark side that empowered them also fueled paranoia and ambition that made stable governance difficult. The Dark Jedi had also brought their fundamental conflict with the Jedi Order. While the Sith species had no particular animosity toward the Jedi, had never even encountered them, the exiles burned with desire for revenge against those who had defeated and exiled them. This vendetta would eventually draw the Sith Empire into conflict with the Republic, with devastating consequences. Over the decades following the exiles' arrival, the distinction between Dark Jedi and Sith gradually disappeared. The exiles stopped thinking of themselves as fallen Jedi and began identifying primarily as Sith. Their children and students, raised in Sith tradition but trained in exile techniques, had no memory of the Republic or the Jedi Order except through stories. To them, being Sith was not a transformation but simply what they were. The Sith species, meanwhile, came to see the human influence as simply part of being Sith. The techniques the exiles had introduced became traditional. The philosophical framework Sorza Sin had articulated became accepted wisdom. The organizational structures a Junta Pal had established became the natural order of things. Within 2 or 3 generations, no clear line existed between what came from the exiles and what came from the original Sith. This is why the question of who was first is so complicated. The Sith Order as we know it, the tradition of Dark Lords wielding red lightsabers and commanding dark side powers, did not exist before the merger of these two groups. A Junta Pal could not have created it without the Sith species and their accumulated knowledge. The Sith species would never have developed into the threat they became without the organization and techniques brought by the exiles. The first true Sith, in the sense of the unified tradition that would persist for millennia, were neither the exiles nor the species but the hybrid civilization that emerged from their merger. This civilization combined elements from both sources into something that was greater and more terrible than either could have been alone. Understanding this transformation helps explain the later history of the Sith. Why they were so formidable despite relatively small numbers? Because they combined diverse sources of knowledge and power. Why they could never achieve lasting unity? Because they inherited the Dark Jedi tendency toward infighting, along with the Sith species' cultural acceptance of conflict. Why they posed such a threat to the Jedi and the Republic? Because they represented everything the Jedi had rejected, refined, and focused by thousands of years of accumulated dark side wisdom. The transformation was complete when the last of the original 12 exiles died and was entombed in the Valley of the Dark Lords, their legacy secure in the civilization they had created.
By then, the Sith Empire had spread across numerous star systems.
Sith academies trained new generations in the dark side. Sith Lords ruled over vast territories. And the name Sith had transformed from referring to a species into identifying an order, a philosophy, and a way of life that would endure long after the original species had been diluted nearly out of existence. This transformation, this fusion of human Dark Jedi and the Sith species into a unified tradition, represents perhaps the most honest answer to our question. The first true Sith were not an individual, but a moment, a process, a meeting of two dark side traditions that created something new. King Addis may have been first chronologically, a Junta Pal may have been first among the Dark Lords, but the Sith, as we know them, were born from transformation, from the merger of species and philosophy that occurred on Korriban around 6,900 years before the Battle of Yavin. And once that transformation was complete, The Sith would become an enduring part of galactic history, a dark reflection of the Jedi Order that would challenge the light side for tens of thousands of years to come. The question was no longer who was first, but what the Sith would become and how far their shadow would spread across the stars. Now that we have traced the history of both the Sith species and the Dark Jedi exiles who conquered them, we must confront the philosophical heart of our question. What does it mean to be Sith at all? Is it an ethnic identity? A philosophical position? A title earned through specific actions? The answer to who was first depends entirely on how we define the term itself. If we define Sith in the most literal sense, as a member of the Sith species, then the answer reaches back into prehistory, to the first red-skinned, Force-sensitive beings who evolved or emerged on Korriban, tens of thousands of years before the Jedi Order existed. These original Sith had no connection to the philosophical tradition we associate with the name. They were simply a people, living their lives on a harsh desert world, developing their own culture and approach to the Force they called magic. In this interpretation, someone like King Adas has the strongest claim to being the first true Sith. He was born of the Sith species, rose to become their king, unified them under his rule, and exemplified their values. His 300-year reign defined what it meant to be Sith for the people of Korriban. He was the Sithari, the chosen one, the perfect embodiment of his species and their way of life. So, no one before or after could claim to be more truly Sith in this ethnic cultural sense, but this interpretation creates problems. If being Sith is purely about species membership, then the Sith effectively went extinct sometime after the arrival of the Dark Jedi exiles, as interbreeding diluted the pure bloodlines into hybrid populations. The Sith purebloods who later claimed that name were genetically distinct from the original species, carrying human DNA alongside Sith characteristics. By the time of the Great Hyperspace War, true pure Sith were already rare. By the time of Darth Bane, they had vanished completely. This interpretation also means that figures we universally recognize as Sith, Darth Revan, Darth Bane, Darth Sidious, would not actually be Sith at all. They were humans who adopted Sith philosophy and claimed Sith titles, but they had no genetic connection to the original species. If being Sith requires species membership, then the Sith Order as we know it is misnamed, a human tradition that appropriated the identity of an extinct people.
Few would find this interpretation satisfying.
When we speak of the Sith in Star Wars, we are almost always referring to the philosophical and organizational tradition. Not to a specific species, we mean the Dark Lords who wielded red lightsabers, pursued power through passion, and opposed the Jedi Order. The species may have provided the name, but the Order is what matters to galactic history. This brings us to the second interpretation. If Sith refers to the philosophical tradition and organizational structure, then Ajunta Paul has the strongest claim to being first. He led the transformation of the Dark Jedi exiles into the first Sith Lords. He established the hierarchy with the Dark Lord at its apex. He oversaw the merger of Jedi-derived techniques with Sith species traditions. He created, or at least presided over, the creation of the Sith Order as we understand it. Under Paul's leadership, being Sith became something more than just ethnic identity. It became a choice, a commitment to a particular philosophy and way of life. A being could become Sith through training and dedication, regardless of their species or origin. This is the interpretation that allows for the Sith tradition to continue even after the original species had been absorbed into hybrid populations and eventually disappeared entirely. This interpretation aligns with how the term was used throughout most of galactic history.
When the Republic fought the Sith Empire in the Great Hyperspace War, They were fighting an organization led by Dark Lords, like Naga Sado, not a species.
When the Jedi battled Darth Revan and Darth Malak, they faced former Jedi who had turned to the dark side and claimed the Sith title. When Darth Sidious orchestrated the fall of the Republic, he was a human practicing Sith philosophy rather than a member of the Sith species. But even this interpretation presents complications. If Ajunta Paul created the Sith Order, he did so by building on foundations laid by the Sith species. The philosophy he and the other exiles developed incorporated ideas from Sith tradition. The techniques they taught combined what they had learned from Jedi training with what they discovered in Sith holocrons and scrolls. The very name they took was borrowed from the people they conquered. Paul did not create the Sith from nothing. He transformed existing elements, combining them in new ways, organizing them into a structured order. This makes him more of a founder than a creator, someone who brought disparate pieces together into a coherent whole, rather than inventing something entirely new. Perhaps the most accurate answer is that the Sith as we know them emerged from a process, rather than from any single individual. The transformation that occurred on Korriban after the exiles' arrival created something that was neither the original Sith species nor the Dark Jedi Rebellion, but a fusion of both. The first true Sith in this sense were the hybrid generation, the children of exiles and natives who were raised in this merged tradition. These first-generation hybrids would have experienced Sith identity in a way their parents could not. The exiles always remembered being Jedi first, remembered the Republic and the order they had left behind. The native Sith remembered a time before the pale-skinned strangers arrived, remembered their own traditions before the merger. But the hybrid generation knew only the unified tradition. To them there was no separation between Jedi techniques and Sith sorcery. It was all simply what it meant to be Sith. This interpretation has the advantage of acknowledging both the species and the order, recognizing that the Sith tradition emerged from the meeting of two groups rather than being created by either alone. It sees being Sith as something that evolved, that changed over time, that meant different things in different eras, but it also makes it impossible to point to a single individual as first. If the first true Sith were a generation rather than a person, then our question has no simple answer. We can identify important figures, King Addis, who unified the species, Ajunta Paul, who organized the order, Sorza Sin, who articulated the philosophy, but none of them alone can claim to be the first. There is yet another interpretation worth considering. Perhaps what makes someone truly Sith is not species membership or philosophical agreement, but a specific relationship with the dark side of the Force. To be Sith in this view is to have fully embraced the dark side, to draw power from passion and emotion, to seek domination and control rather than harmony and peace.
Under this definition, there could have been Sith before anyone used that name.
Any Force user who chose the dark path, who used their powers for selfish gain and domination, who drew strength from anger and fear, could be considered Sith in essence even if they never heard the term. The First Great Schism, which occurred thousands of years before the Second Great Schism that led to the exiles' creation, produced dark side users who might qualify as Sith by this definition. Conversely, this interpretation might exclude some who claimed the Sith name. There have been individuals throughout history who called themselves Sith, but whose connection to the dark side was questionable or incomplete. Were they truly Sith, or merely pretenders who claimed a title without embodying what it meant? This philosophical approach recognizes that identity is complex, that names and labels can mean different things to different people, that what it means to be Sith might have changed over the millennia as the tradition evolved. It acknowledges that there might not be a single correct answer to our question, that different valid perspectives might lead to different conclusions. The debate over species versus order is not merely academic, it shaped how the Sith saw themselves throughout their history. In the old Sith Empire, when Sith pureblood still existed in significant numbers, there was tension between those who claimed superiority based on their genetic heritage and those who argued that power and skill mattered more than bloodlines. Some Sith Lords looked down on human or alien members of the Order, seeing them as inferior to those who carried Sith blood. This prejudice was never universal and gradually faded as pure Sith genetics became increasingly rare. By the time of the New Sith Wars, thousands of years after the exiles' arrival on Caravan, the Sith Order included members of numerous species. The Sith purebloods who remained were so heavily hybridized that pure was a relative term at best. Being Sith had clearly become about philosophy and power rather than genetics. Darth Bane's rule of two, established around 1,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, represented the ultimate triumph of the philosophical interpretation. Bane reduced the Sith to just two individuals at a time, master and apprentice, and explicitly stated that species or origin did not matter. What mattered was strength in the dark side, willingness to pursue power ruthlessly, and commitment to the Sith cause. Under the rule of two, the Sith became a pure ideological tradition, untethered from any connection to the original species. Yet even Bane acknowledged the importance of history. He studied the ancient Sith, learned from their successes and failures, sought to understand what had made them powerful and what had led to their defeats. He saw himself as part of a continuous tradition stretching back to the earliest Dark Lords, a link in a chain that connected him to Ajunta Pall, and through Pall, to the original Sith species. The question of what makes someone truly Sith has practical implications as well. Throughout history, various dark side users have claimed the Sith name without clear connection to the organized order. Were they Sith, or merely dark Jedi who appropriated a title? Does calling yourself Sith make you Sith, or must you be trained by Sith, accepted into the order, proven worthy of the name? The lost tribe of Sith, who were isolated on the remote world of Kash for thousands of years, maintained Sith traditions and identity despite having no contact with the larger Sith Order. They descended from followers of Remulus Draper who had crashed on that world. Were they truly Sith during their millennia of isolation, or did they only become Sith again when they reconnected with the wider galaxy? Darth Sidious faced similar questions when he encountered dark side traditions that existed parallel to the Sith. The Night Sisters of Dathomir practiced dark side magic but did not consider themselves Sith. The Inquisitors he created were dark side users who served him but were not true Sith. Where was the line between Sith and non-Sith dark side users? These questions ultimately come down to authority. Who gets to decide what Sith means? The original species is gone, unable to weigh in on whether later Dark Lords properly carried their legacy. The early Dark Lords like Ajunta Pall are long dead, though Pall's spirit at least seemed to recognize Revan as legitimately connected to Sith tradition, despite Revan being a former Jedi rather than a member of the continuous Sith lineage. Perhaps the answer is that being Sith has always been about self-identification combined with power.
If you claim to be Sith and possess sufficient strength to make that claim stick, then you are Sith.
If others recognize and fear you as Sith, if your power compels respect or submission, then the philosophical or genetic questions become irrelevant. In a tradition built on the principle that might makes right, the strongest interpretation is the correct one. This is consistent with how the Sith themselves seem to view identity. They did not require proof of lineage or certification of training. A Sith was someone who possessed power, claimed the title, and could defend that claim against challenges. The dark side itself was the ultimate arbiter. If the Force granted you power and you used it in the Sith way, then you were Sith regardless of how you arrived at that point. So we return to our original question, with multiple possible answers, each valid from different perspectives. King Addis was the first Sith, if we mean the first great exemplar of the original species. Ajunta Pall was the first Sith Lord, the first leader of the organized order. The hybrid generation were the first to be born into the unified Sith tradition, and perhaps some unknown dark side user in the deep past was the first to truly embody what it would mean to be Sith, even before the name existed. The lack of a single simple answer is not a failure of historical research, but rather a reflection of the Sith's complexity. They evolved over millennia, changed with each generation, adapted to new circumstances while maintaining core principles. What it meant to be Sith in King Addis's time was different from what it meant in Ajunta Pall's era, which differed from what it meant to Darth Bane, which differed from what it meant to Darth Sidious. And yet, running through all these different eras and interpretations, certain themes remained constant. The embrace of passion over peace, the pursuit of power as an end in itself, the willingness to dominate others and impose one's will on the galaxy, the belief that conflict and struggle were necessary and valuable. These core principles connect all who claim the Sith name, from the ancient species on Korriban to the last Dark Lord plotting in the shadows. Understanding that the Sith emerged from transformation rather than creation, from fusion rather than invention, from evolution rather than design, helps us appreciate both their staying power and their ultimate weakness. They endured because they could adapt, could incorporate new knowledge and techniques, could survive the death of any particular generation or incarnation, but they failed ultimately because their core principles, the passion and ambition that empowered them, also drove them to betray and destroy each other. The first Sith, whoever we decide that was, could not have foreseen how long their legacy would endure or how far it would spread. But they set in motion forces that would shape galactic history for tens of thousands of years, creating a tradition that would stand as the greatest threat the Jedi Order ever faced. And in that sense, the question of who was first matters less than the recognition that their creation, however it began, changed everything that came after.
The legacy of the first Sith.
Whether we point to King Addis or Ajunta Pall or some other figure as the first Sith, their legacy echoes through galactic history in ways both obvious and subtle. The choices made by these ancient figures, the traditions they established, the philosophies they articulated, all of it shaped how billions of beings would live and die across thousands of years. King Addis's most enduring legacy was perhaps his demonstration that the Sith species could be unified under a single powerful ruler. For 3 centuries, Korriban knew peace under his reign, a remarkable achievement for a people whose culture celebrated conflict and competition. This precedent would inspire later Sith Lords who dreamed of creating lasting unity among their fractious followers. But Addis also established the problematic pattern of tying Sith unity to a single individual's power and lifespan. When he died defending Korriban against the Rakata, the empire he had built immediately dissolved back into warring factions. This cycle of unity under a strong leader, followed by fragmentation upon their death, would repeat throughout Sith history.
A fundamental weakness built into a society that valued individual strength above all else.
The holocron of King Addis became a teaching tool for millennia, passing through the hands of countless Sith over the ages.
When the Dark Jedi exiles arrived on Korriban, they acquired this holocron and studied its contents.
Ajunta Pal and his followers learned about Adas's reign, his techniques, his understanding of Sith culture. In a very real sense, Adasas himself taught the first Dark Lords, shaping the order they would create. The holocron's journey through history provides a thread connecting disparate eras of Sith civilization. Freedon Nad, a fallen Jedi Knight who lived thousands of years after the exiles, discovered Adas's holocron on the planet Asher's Re, where it had been lost during the Great Hyperspace War. From Adas's teachings, Nad gained power sufficient to conquer and rule the world of Onderon. He passed the knowledge forward to his own students, who in turn influenced others. Even Dark Lords who lived tens of thousands of years after Adas's death drew inspiration from his example. Darth Sidious, who orchestrated the destruction of the Jedi Order and transformation of the Republic into the Galactic Empire, saw himself as fulfilling the destiny that Adas had first envisioned for the Sith. The title of Sithari, which originated with Adus, became a prophetic ideal that later Sith believed would be fulfilled by a chosen one who would lead the Sith to ultimate victory. Ajunta Pal's legacy was more direct and comprehensive. As the first Dark Lord of the Sith, he created the organizational structure that would define the Order for thousands of years. The concept of a single supreme Dark Lord with subordinate Sith Lords serving beneath him became standard. The hierarchy of master and apprentice, of greater and lesser Sith, originated with Paul's organization of the exiles and their Sith subjects. Paul also established the precedent of combining different Force traditions. Before him, there were Jedi techniques and Sith sorcery, but they existed separately. Paul and his fellow exiles demonstrated that these could be merged, that a single individual could master both sophisticated Jedi abilities and raw Sith power. Every subsequent Sith Lord who wielded a lightsaber while also commanding dark-side sorcery was following the path Paul pioneered. The Valley of the Dark Lords on Korriban stands as a physical monument to Paul's legacy. He was among the first of the Dark Lords to be entombed there, and his tomb became a place of pilgrimage for later Sith seeking to connect with their origins. For thousands of years, aspiring Sith would venture into Paul's tomb, hoping to find artifacts or insights that would grant them power.
Some, like the Jedi Knight Revan during the Jedi Civil War, encountered Paul's lingering spirit and learned from it directly.
But Paul's legacy also included the seeds of the Sith's eventual failures. The constant competition he encouraged among Sith Lords, while selecting for strength and skill, also created endemic instability. Sith rarely cooperated effectively because they were always positioning themselves to betray their rivals. Sith empires rose to great power but invariably collapsed under the weight of internal conflicts. But first, this pattern, established during Paul's reign, would repeat throughout Sith history. The other members of the original 12 exiles each contributed their own elements to Sith tradition. Sorza Sin's mastery of alchemy became foundational to how Sith approached the manipulation of life. Her creation of the great amulets, talismans of extraordinary power given to Carnis Moore and Remulus Draper, demonstrated the heights that Sith artifact creation could reach. Her writings, particularly her chronicle that became part of the Book of Sith, preserved knowledge that would teach Sith Lords for millennia. Sin's articulation of the Sith Code was perhaps her greatest contribution. By putting into words the philosophy that guided Sith thinking, she created a rallying point and teaching tool that could be transmitted across generations. Young Sith could learn the code, meditate on its meaning, use it to guide their development. Even Sith who had never heard of Sorza Sin personally were shaped by the philosophy she had helped create. Zoxan's legacy lived on through her expertise in dark side healing and her role in establishing Sith training methods.
Her holocron, which she created before her death, became another teaching tool for future generations.
Thousands of years later, during the Legacy era around 130 years after the Battle of Yavin, the fallen Jedi,
Asharad Het would discover Zoxan's holocron and learn from her spirit, ultimately becoming Darth Krayt and founding a new Sith order.
even across vast spans of time, the first Sith continued to directly teach their distant successors. Karnas Mor's creation of the Rakhul Plague had consequences that extended far beyond his lifetime. The Mor talisman, which Sorzasen had crafted for him, could transform beings into Rakhuls under Mor's control. When Mor's physical body was killed, his spirit survived within the talisman, continuing to spread the plague across the galaxy. Thousands of years later, worlds like Taris would be infected with Rakghouls descended from Mor's original creations. The Jedi, Celeste Morn, who became bonded to the Mor talisman during the Mandalorian Wars, carried Mor's spirit for thousands of years before it was finally destroyed. Remulus Draper's influence came partly through his rivalry with Mor and his creation of the Oubliette, designed to contain his fellow exile.
But Draper also contributed to Sith expansion beyond Korriban, using his naval expertise to organize fleets that would conquer neighboring systems.
His eventual departure from the Stygian caldera with a faction of followers, which led to conflict with Jedi pursuers on the world of Kashyyyk, seeded another Sith civilization that would develop in isolation for thousands of years. The lost tribe of Sith on Kashyyyk preserved many traditions from the era of the original exiles. Though they evolved in their own direction during millennia of isolation, they maintained knowledge of the ancient Sith lords and their teachings. When they eventually reconnected with the wider galaxy, they brought perspectives and techniques that had been preserved in a form closer to what the original exiles had practiced. Collectively, the first Sith lords established patterns that would define the Order forever after, the embrace of the dark side not as a tool but as a way of life. The pursuit of power as an end in itself rather than a means to some other goal.
The acceptance of betrayal and conflict as natural and necessary.
The view of the Jedi as enemies to be destroyed rather than merely opposed. All of these became core elements of Sith identity, traceable back to the choices and teachings of the first generation. Their legacy also included the fundamental conflict between individual power and collective strength. The Sith wanted both to be individually supreme and to command vast empires. These goals were in tension. A truly supreme individual would tolerate no rivals, but building an empire required working with and through other powerful beings. The first Sith Lords never fully resolved this tension, and neither would any of their successors. The cycle of Sith history, rise and fall repeated across millennia, originated with these first Sith. They built the first Sith Empire, which reached great power before eventually collapsing in the Great Hyperspace War. From those ruins, new Sith civilizations would emerge. Darth Revan's Sith Empire, the Sith Empire of Darth Vitiate. The new Sith Wars, the rule of two Sith who ultimately destroyed the Jedi Order and seized control of the galaxy. Each was an echo of what the first Sith had created. Even the Sith's ultimate defeat can be traced back to foundations laid by the first generation. Their emphasis on individual power over collective welfare made Sith unable to sustain lasting civilizations. Their embrace of betrayal as a virtue meant that Sith could rarely trust each other enough to cooperate effectively. Their hatred of the Jedi ensured ongoing conflict that eventually led to their own destruction. The seeds of failure were planted alongside the seeds of power. Yet for all their flaws and the suffering their legacy caused across the galaxy, the first Sith achieved something remarkable. They created a tradition that survived for over 25,000 years, from King Oedipus's rise around 28,000 BBY to the final death of Darth Sidious around 35 ABY.
Few civilizations, philosophies, or organizations have endured for such vast spans of time.
The Sith proved more persistent than empires, more adaptable than most religions, more resilient than the governments that rose and fell around them. This endurance came from the core insights preserved from the first Sith. They understood that the dark side of the Force offered genuine power, that passion could be a source of strength rather than weakness, that there would always be beings willing to pursue dominance over others. As long as sentient beings experienced fear, anger, hatred, and desire, there would be potential for the Sith or something like them to emerge. The first Sith, whether we identify them as King Oedipus, Ajunta Pall, or the collective generation of exiles and natives who merged into the unified tradition, gave form to impulses that had always existed. They created a structure and philosophy that allowed these dark impulses to be channeled and amplified. They proved that the dark side could build civilizations, not just destroy them. They demonstrated that passion and power could be organized and transmitted across generations. Their legacy is written in the stars themselves, in the worlds devastated by Sith conquest, in the billions who lived and died under Sith rule, in the Jedi who fell to the dark side and became Sith themselves, in the final triumph and ultimate defeat of Darth Sidious's empire. To understand Star Wars is to understand the Sith. To understand the Sith, we must trace their lineage back to the beginning, to those first figures who created this dark tradition. Canon versus Legends, the modern divide, our exploration of who was the first Sith, has drawn heavily on what is now known as Star Wars Legends, the expanded universe continuity that existed before Disney's acquisition of Lucasfilm in 2012. This material, contained in novels, comics, games, and reference books, provided rich detail about Sith history spanning tens of thousands of years. But when Disney reset the Star Wars canon, much of this history was relegated to legends status, non-canonical stories that might or might not reflect the true history of the Star Wars universe. So what does current Star Wars canon say about the first Sith? The honest answer is, not much. Canon has been deliberately vague about Sith origins, providing only broad strokes rather than the detailed history available in Legends material. What we know from canon is limited to a few key points. There was an event called the 100-Year Darkness, where a rogue Jedi began experimenting with the dark side, leading to a schism within the Jedi Order. This unnamed fallen Jedi created or discovered the Sith philosophy, though details about exactly what happened remain unclear. The conflict ended with the Dark Jedi being exiled, but rather than dying out, they eventually returned as the Sith Order that would plague the galaxy for millennia. Canon confirms that a planet called Moraband, formerly known as Korriban, was the ancient homeworld of the Sith. This world appears in Star Wars: The Clone Wars animated series, specifically in an episode where Yoda travels there and encounters the spirits of ancient Sith lords. The tombs visible on Moraband match descriptions of the Valley of the Dark Lords from Legends, suggesting some continuity in the basic geography and history. Canon also establishes that Darth Bane created the rule of two roughly 1,000 years before the events of the Phantom Menace. Bane appears as a Force ghost in the Clone Wars, confirming his place in official continuity. His philosophy of limiting the Sith to one master and one apprentice remains central to understanding how the Sith operated during the prequel era. But beyond these broad points, canon provides little detail. We don't have canonical confirmation of the Sith species as distinct from the Sith Order. Ajunta Pall is not mentioned by name in canon material. The 12 Exiles, Sorza Sin's writings, King Oedipus's reign, all of this exists only in Legends continuity. Canon leaves the deep history of the Sith largely blank, a mystery waiting to be filled in. This creates an interesting situation for our question. In Legends continuity, we can construct detailed arguments about whether King Adus or Ajunta Pal deserves to be called the first Sith. We can examine the nuances of species versus philosophy, trace the transformation of the Dark Jedi exiles into Sith Lords, and analyze how the merger of two traditions created something new. In canon, we simply don't have enough information to make such detailed arguments. The first Sith, according to canon, was an unnamed Jedi Knight who lived thousands of years before the Clone Wars and who turned to the dark side. That's essentially the extent of what canon confirms. This ambiguity is likely intentional. By keeping Sith origins vague, Lucasfilm preserves flexibility to tell new stories exploring this history without being constrained by extensive Legends material. If they wanted to introduce a canonical version of Ajunta Pal or King Adus, they could do so while potentially changing significant details to better serve new narratives. Some Legends elements have been gradually reintroduced to canon. The planet Korriban returned as Moraband. Sith alchemy and the creation of Sith spawn have been referenced in various canon sources, suggesting that the Sith's mastery of dark side manipulation of life remains part of their history. The concept of ancient Sith lords whose knowledge influenced later generations has been preserved, even if specific names and stories have changed. The Acolyte television series, set in the High Republic era, roughly 100 years before The Phantom Menace, has begun to explore Sith presence during that earlier period. This may eventually provide more canonical details about Sith history and origins, though as of the current moment, such information remains limited. For fans and scholars trying to understand Star Wars lore, this creates a challenging situation.
Do we treat Legends material as a useful guide to understanding Sith history even though it's not officially canonical?
Do we wait for new canon material to provide definitive answers? Do we acknowledge that different continuities might give different answers to questions like, who was the first Sith? Most serious engagement with Star Wars lore takes a pragmatic approach. Legends material is treated as a detailed and rich source of information about Star Wars history, with the understanding that canon might contradict or modify it. When canon is silent on a topic, Legends fills the gap, providing plausible answers even if they're not officially endorsed. When canon contradicts Legends, the canonical version takes precedence, but Legends material often provides valuable context and depth for our specific question about the first Sith. This means we can draw on the detailed Legends history, while acknowledging that canon might eventually tell a different story. Perhaps in canon there was no Sith species at all, and the name was always purely a title chosen by Dark Jedi. Perhaps King Adus will be reintroduced to canon with a completely different history. Perhaps Ajunta Pal will remain a Legends-only character, with someone new filling the role of the first Dark Lord. The divide between canon and Legends also raises philosophical questions about truth and authority in fictional universes. Who decides what really happened in Star Wars history? The original creator, George Lucas, sold the rights to Disney, so does his vision take precedence, or does Disney's? If Legends material was officially published and sold for decades, does it have some claim to authenticity even after being declared non-canonical? These questions don't have simple answers, but they matter to how we engage with stories like Star Wars that have extensive lore developed across multiple media and many years. The first Sith has one answer in Legends and a different, much vaguer answer in canon, and both can be true in their respective continuations, while neither can claim absolute authority over the other. For our purposes, we can acknowledge both possibilities. In Legends, the first Sith were either King Adus or Ajunta Pal, depending on how we define Sith. with the most accurate answer being the hybrid generation that emerged from the merger of Dark Jedi exiles and the Sith species. In canon, the first Sith was an unnamed fallen Jedi, whose specific identity and story remain to be revealed. This ambiguity actually enriches the Star Wars universe in some ways. It preserves mystery, maintaining the Sith as ancient and somewhat unknowable rather than fully documented. It allows for new stories to be told exploring Sith origins without being constrained by previous narratives. It creates space for different interpretations and perspectives on who the Sith were and what they represented. The canonical silence on detailed Sith history also means that elements from legends could be reintroduced at any time. A future Star Wars series or film could canonize aspects of the legend's history, bringing back King Addus or Ajunta Pall or the story of the exiles discovering Korriban. Until such canonization occurs, these figures exist in a liminal state, part of Star Wars lore and cultural understanding, even if not officially part of the current canonical timeline. What remains consistent across both continuities is the core concept of the Sith as an ancient dark side tradition that opposed the Jedi for millennia before being defeated. Whether they originated with a Sith species or purely with fallen Jedi, whether their first leader was named Addus or Paul or something else, they represented a persistent threat that shaped galactic history through their very existence. The question of who was first may have different answers in different continuities, but the importance of that beginning remains constant. Understanding Sith origins, however we define them, helps us comprehend the whole arc of their history, from those ancient first steps into darkness through to their ultimate defeat at the hands of the Chosen One who brought balance to the Force. The first Sith's enduring impact, whether we're discussing canon or legends, whether we identify King Addus or Ajunta Pall or the unnamed fallen Jedi from canon as the first Sith, their impact on the galaxy cannot be overstated. The decisions made and traditions established by these ancient figures echoed forward through time, influencing events that would occur tens of thousands of years later. Consider the architecture. The tombs built in the Valley of the Dark Lords on Korriban/Moraband stood for millennia, enduring long after the Sith who commissioned them had died and their empires had fallen. These structures influenced later Sith aesthetics. When Darth Vader designed his castle on Mustafar, when Darth Sidious built his throne room in the Imperial Palace, when Exegol was prepared as a hidden Sith stronghold, all of these drew on architectural traditions established by the first Sith. The imposing, fear-inducing design philosophy that characterized Sith construction originated with those ancient builders who wanted their monuments to inspire awe and terror. Future Sith would inherit this aesthetic sense, understanding that power must be made visible, that domination operated on psychological as well as physical levels, that architecture could be a weapon in its own right. The tradition of master and apprentice, which would later be formalized in Darth Bane's Rule of Two, originated with the first Sith's approach to training. Ajunta Pall and his fellow exiles trained a generation of students who would succeed them as Sith Lords. Those students trained their own apprentices, creating a lineage of knowledge transmission that stretched across thousands of years. Even when the Sith Order fragmented and reformed multiple times, this pattern of a master teaching an apprentice remained consistent. The lightsaber, one of the most iconic elements of Star Wars, was perfected as a Sith weapon through traditions established by the first Dark Lords.
While the Jedi invented the lightsaber, the Sith innovated in its application.
They developed fighting forms like Juyo and Vapad that embraced passion and aggression. They created synthetic crystals that produced the red blades that became synonymous with the dark side. They understood that a lightsaber was more than a tool. It was an extension of the wielder's will, powered by their connection to the Force. The first Sith also established a pattern of Sith remaining hidden when weak and revealing themselves when strong. After defeats, Sith would retreat into shadows, preserving their knowledge and rebuilding their strength. After the Great Hyperspace War destroyed the original Sith Empire, survivors fled to unknown space and established secret civilizations that would later return. After the devastating defeats of the new Sith Wars, Darth Bane instituted the Rule of Two and took the Sith underground for 1,000 years. This ability to endure through periods of weakness, to preserve knowledge and tradition even when reduced to a single master and apprentice, ensured Sith survival. The philosophical framework created by the first Sith proved remarkably adaptable. The Sith code that Sorza Sin articulated could be interpreted and reinterpreted by countless generations of Sith Lords, each finding their own meaning in its words while maintaining continuity with the tradition. Darth Bane's Rule of Two was revolutionary in limiting Sith numbers, but it built on philosophical foundations laid millennia earlier. Darth Sidious's political machinations and manipulation of the Republic drew on principles of power and domination that the first Sith had understood. Even specific techniques pioneered by the first Sith remained relevant thousands of years later. Sith alchemy, which Sorza Sin and others developed by combining Jedi knowledge with ancient Sith tradition, would be practiced by Sith lords throughout history. Darth Plagueis used alchemical techniques to extend life and cheat death. Darth Sidious employed alchemy in creating various Sith spawn and in his own quest for immortality. The fundamental insights about manipulating life through the Force that the first Sith discovered remained powerful tools for their distant successors. The rivalry with the Jedi, which drove so much Sith behavior, originated with the Exiles' defeat and exile at Jedi hands. For the native Sith species, the Jedi were simply another group they had never encountered. But for the exiled Dark Jedi, the Jedi represented everything they hated, the restrictions they had rebelled against, the judges who had condemned them. This hatred was transmitted to future generations of Sith, becoming a core part of their identity even for Sith who had never personally been Jedi. The dream of conquering the Republic and destroying the Jedi Order, which would finally be achieved by Darth Sidious 25,000 years after the exile's arrival on Korriban, was the dream that motivated the first Sith Empire's expansion. Naga Sado's Great Hyperspace War was an attempt to realize this dream. Exar Kun's Sith War, Darth Revan's campaign, the new Sith Wars, all were efforts to achieve what the first Sith had imagined but failed to accomplish. When Sidious finally did destroy the Jedi and transform the Republic into the Empire, he was fulfilling a vision that stretched back to the beginning of Sith history.
The Rule of Two that made his success possible was built on traditions established by the first Dark Lords.
The dark side knowledge he commanded had been accumulated over millennia, passed down through master and apprentice, preserved in holocrons created by ancient Sith. His triumph was personal, but it was also the culmination of 25,000 years of Sith efforts. Even the Sith's ultimate defeat connects to their origins. The prophecy of the Chosen One who would bring balance to the Force emerged in part from Sith concepts like the Sith Ari, the perfect being who would lead the Sith to ultimate victory. Anakin Skywalker, who was that Chosen One, fell to the dark side and became Darth Vader, one of the most powerful Sith in history. But his eventual redemption and destruction of Darth Sidious brought the prophecy to fulfillment in a way the Sith had not anticipated. The cycle that began with the first Sith ended with the last, bringing a form of closure to a conflict that had defined galactic history. Yet even this ending echoed patterns from the beginning. Just as the first Sith emerged from the transformation of Jedi into something darker, so the last Sith was destroyed by a Sith's transformation back toward the light. Anakin's redemption reversed the fall that had created figures like Ajunta Paul thousands of years earlier. The locations associated with the first Sith retained significance throughout Star Wars history. Korriban/Moraband remained a dark side nexus, a place where the Force itself seemed corrupted by millennia of Sith presence. Jedi who traveled there could feel the weight of history, the accumulated darkness of countless Sith who had lived, trained, and died on that world. Even after the Sith were defeated and their empires had fallen, Korriban remained a tomb, a monument to the civilization that the first Sith had created. The Valley of the Dark Lord specifically became a place of pilgrimage and trial. Sith who wanted to prove themselves would venture into the ancient tombs, facing whatever spirits and dangers lurked within. Jedi who sought to understand the dark side sometimes traveled there as well, though at great risk. The tombs of Ajunta Paul and the other first Dark Lords contained artifacts and knowledge that remained potent across the millennia. When we consider the full scope of the first Sith's impact, we're forced to recognize that they changed the course of galactic history in fundamental ways. Without them, the Jedi Order might have developed unchallenged, potentially becoming stagnant or complacent. Without the constant threat of the Sith, the Republic might not have maintained its military readiness or its commitment to defending freedom.
The very concept of balance in the Force assumes the presence of both light and dark, and the Sith provided that darkness.
This is not to suggest that the Sith's existence was somehow beneficial or necessary. The suffering they caused across tens of thousands of years is incalculable. Worlds devastated, populations enslaved, countless beings corrupted or destroyed by dark side influence. The Sith represented a path towards suffering and domination, and the galaxy was better off when they were finally defeated. But their impact cannot be denied or ignored. To understand Star Wars is to understand the Sith. To understand the Sith requires tracing their history back to its origins, examining who the first Sith were and what they created. Whether we point to King Adus or Ajunta Paul or some other figure, whether we focus on the species or the order, whether we're discussing canon or legends, we're engaging with a legacy that shaped a galaxy far, far away across vast expanses of time. The first Sith, whoever they were, created something that endured. And in that endurance, they proved that the dark side was not merely destructive, but also creative in its own twisted way, capable of building civilizations and traditions that would persist long after their founders had become dust. This is their terrible achievement, and understanding it brings us closer to understanding the full complexity of the Star Wars saga. Conclusion. Many firsts. One dark legacy we've journeyed across tens of thousands of years of galactic history, from the ancient Sith species on Korriban through the rise and fall of countless Sith empires, seeking to answer what seemed like a simple question. Who was the first Sith? Along the way, we've discovered that simplicity was an illusion, that this question opens into depths of philosophy, history, and identity that resist easy answers. If we define Sith as membership in the original species, then the first Sith reaches back into the prehistory of Korriban to red-skinned Force sensitives who evolved or emerged on that desert world long before recorded history. Among these ancient Sith, King Adus stands as the greatest exemplar, the Sithari who unified his people and defended them against extragalactic invasion. His 300-year reign defined what it meant to be Sith for the native species, establishing traditions and demonstrating power that would influence all who came after. Adus was in this sense the first true Sith. He embodied the species' values, mastered their sorcery to unprecedented levels, achieved what no Sith before him had accomplished. His holocron preserved knowledge that would teach generations of Sith Lords who had never met him. His example inspired the prophecy of the Sith Ari that would shape Sith thinking for millennia. When the Dark Jedi exiles arrived on Korriban 21,000 years after his death, they found his legacy still alive in Sith culture and tradition. But if we define Sith as the philosophical order and tradition of Dark Lords, then Ajunta Pall has the strongest claim to being first. He led the transformation of exiled Dark Jedi into the founders of the Sith Order. He established the title of Jenari, the Dark Lord of the Sith, who ruled over other Sith Lords. He organized the merger of Jedi techniques and Sith sorcery into a unified approach to the dark side. Under his leadership, being Sith became more than ethnic identity. It became a choice and a commitment to a way of life built on passion and power. Paul created the organizational structure that would define the Sith for thousands of years. The hierarchy of master and apprentice, the competition for advancement, the combination of individual ambition with collective purpose, all of these originated with how he organized the early Sith Order. His tomb in the Valley of the Dark Lords became a place where future Sith could connect with their origins. His spirit, bound to that tomb by dark side energy and perhaps by regret, taught Revan millennia after his death. In him, the transformation from Jedi to Dark Jedi to Sith Lord was complete.
Yet neither Adis nor Paul alone can claim to be the sole first Sith. The Sith as we know them emerged from the collision and merger of two traditions, the native Sith species with their millennia of dark side practice, and the exiled Dark Jedi with their sophisticated understanding of the Force and their determination to build something new. The first true Sith in the sense of the unified tradition might be the hybrid generation, those children of exiles and natives who were born into a world where Jedi techniques and Sith sorcery had already merged, where being Sith meant embracing both legacies. This perspective acknowledges that the Sith were not created by any single individual but evolved through a process of cultural fusion. The species provided the name, the connection to Korriban, the ancient knowledge of dark side alchemy and sorcery. The exiles brought organizational skills, Jedi-derived Force techniques, advanced technology, and a burning desire for revenge against the Jedi Order. Together, these elements combined into something that was greater and more terrible than either could have been alone. Sorza Sin, Jozan, Carnus Moor, Remulus Draper, and the other exiles alongside Paul each contributed essential elements to the emerging Sith tradition.
Sin's alchemical mastery and articulation of the Sith code,
Zozan's healing abilities and training methods, Moor's tactical innovations and creation of the Rakhul Plague, Draper's naval expertise and ambition for conquest. The 12 working together created a civilization that would endure for millennia. In canon, the question remains open. The first Sith identified only as an unnamed fallen Jedi from thousands of years before the Clone Wars. This ambiguity preserves mystery while allowing future stories to explore Sith origins without being constrained by extensive Legends material. Perhaps canon will eventually provide its own version of King Adis or Ajunta Pall. Perhaps it will tell an entirely different story of how the Sith began. Until then, we can only say that canon acknowledges the Sith as ancient, their origins lost in the distant past. What we can say with certainty across both canon and legends is that the Sith began in darkness and built their tradition on principles that would guide dark side users for tens of thousands of years. The embrace of passion over serenity, the pursuit of power as an end rather than a means, the acceptance of conflict as necessary and valuable, the willingness to dominate others and impose one's will on the galaxy. These core tenets remained consistent from the first Sith through to the last. The legacy of the first Sith, whoever they were, shaped galactic history in profound ways. Every conflict between Jedi and Sith echoed back to those original confrontations. Every Sith Lord who built an empire was attempting to fulfill dreams that began with the first Dark Lords. Every dark side technique mastered by later Sith drew on knowledge accumulated starting with those ancient beginnings. The architecture, the philosophy, the very aesthetics of the dark side all trace their lineage to those first steps into darkness. Understanding that the Sith emerged from transformation rather than creation helps us appreciate both their persistence and their ultimate failure. They endured because they could adapt, incorporating new knowledge while maintaining core principles. They could survive the death of any particular generation or empire because the tradition itself was larger than any individual. But they failed because those core principles, the passion and ambition that empowered them, also drove them to betray and destroy each other.
The very things that made them strong as individuals made them weak as a collective.
The question of who was first matters less than recognizing that their creation changed everything. Whether we credit King Adas or Ajunta Paul or the hybrid generation or some other figure, we're acknowledging that the Sith began at a specific point in history and grew into a force that shaped the destiny of the galaxy. They were not inevitable, not an eternal presence that had always existed. Someone made choices, established traditions, articulated philosophies that created what would become the Sith. Those choices echoed forward across time. When Darth Sidious orchestrated the fall of the Republic and the destruction of the Jedi Order, he was fulfilling a vision that originated with the first Sith. When Anakin Skywalker fell to the dark side and became Darth Vader, he was following a path that countless beings had walked before him, starting with those first Dark Lords who transformed from Jedi into something darker. When Luke Skywalker redeemed his father and brought about the Sith's destruction, he was ending a cycle that had begun thousands of years earlier. In the end, perhaps the most accurate answer to our question is that there were many firsts. The first member of the Sith species lost to prehistory. The first great king of the Sith, Adas, the first dark Jedi to fall to the dark side in the second great schism, the first of the 12 exiles to set foot on Korriban, the first Dark Lord of the Sith, Ajunta Paul, the first child born of both exile and native Sith heritage, the first to master both Jedi techniques and Sith sorcery, the first to articulate the Sith code. Each of these firsts contributed to creating the tradition we recognize. The Sith were not born but made, forged from the collision of Jedi idealism with its own shadow, from the meeting of human ambition with alien sorcery, from the transformation of defeat into an opportunity for rebirth. They emerged from darkness, grew strong in it, and ultimately were destroyed by the light they had spent millennia opposing.
Their story began with individuals, whether Addis or Pal or others, who made choices that seemed right to them at the time.
Who sought power, knowledge, freedom from restrictions they found intolerable. Who believed they had discovered truths that others were too afraid to acknowledge. Who thought they could control the darkness rather than being controlled by it. These first Sith, in their ambition and their brilliance and their ultimate corruption, set in motion events that would shape a galaxy across vast expanses of time. And now, thousands of years after those ancient beginnings, as we contemplate the ruins of Sith civilization and remember the conflicts they sparked, we can recognize their story for what it was, a warning about the seductive nature of power, the corrupting influence of unchecked ambition, and the terrible price of choosing domination over compassion. The first Sith created something that endured, but in its endurance brought suffering that makes their achievement something to be remembered rather than celebrated. So the answer to who was the first true Sith, is both simple and complex. Simple in that we can point to figures like King Adus or Junta Paul and recognize their foundational roles. Complex in that being Sith was about more than any individual. It was about a tradition that evolved, a philosophy that adapted, an identity that transformed across generations. The first Sith were all those who contributed to creating the dark legacy that shaped Star Wars history. And in understanding them, in tracing their origins and examining their choices, we come closer to understanding the eternal struggle between light and darkness that lies at the heart of this saga set a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. If you enjoyed learning about the ancient origins of the Sith and want to explore more deep dives into Star Wars lore, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel.
What aspect of early Sith history would you like to see covered next?
The Great Hyperspace War? The individual stories of the 12 Dark Jedi exiles? The Sith species culture before the arrival of the exiles? Let me know in the comments, and may the Force be with you always.